The wind had a way of talking in those parts, not with words, but with whispers that crept through the canyons, carrying stories no one wanted to remember. On nights like that, the land itself seemed alive, like it was breathing slow and heavy beneath the stars. Somewhere out there in that vast loneliness rode a man named Eli Ward, a drifter, a quiet soul who'd long stopped believing that life had anything left to offer him. His horse was lean, his coat worn thin, and his eyes carried the kind of emptiness that comes only from outliving everything you ever cared about. He wasn't young anymore, but he wasn't old either. Stuck in that middle ground where a man starts realizing he's running from things he'll never truly escape. Eli wasn't a wanted man. He hadn't robbed a bank or shot anyone who didn't deserve it. He wasn't chasing gold or glory or even a name. No, Eli was running from memory, a kind that hung around your neck like a stone. He once had a home, a wife, a bit of land down near the Brazos River. Her name was Clara. She'd laugh at the way he said her name, like he was still surprised she'd married him. That laugh had kept him alive through droughts, debts, and the kind of loneliness that creeps into a man's bones when the night stretches too long. Then the fever came. Took her in 3 days flat. No doctor, no preacher, no mercy, just silence. And after he put her in the ground, Eli never really came back from that hill. Years passed. He took work wherever it found him, wrangling cattle, breaking horses, guiding wagon trains across land that didn't want to be crossed. Every town looked the same. Every saloon sounded the same. And every time a woman smiled at him, he'd feel a sting deep in his chest. A reminder that love, once lost, didn't come back easy. The world was full of people trying to fill empty spaces. Eli wasn't one of them. He'd learned to live with his emptiness. It was quiet, dependable, didn't ask for anything. By the fall of 1874, he found himself pushing north into Apache country, following no road in particular. The nights were getting colder, the sky bruised with snow clouds, and the wind carried that sharp edge that tells a man winter's coming whether he's ready or not. His horse, a black gelding named Juniper, limped slightly from a bad stone bruise. Eli knew they'd need shelter soon. He'd crossed into a stretch of land few white men stayed in, not because it was dangerous, but because it demanded respect. The locals called it the Whispering Mesa. Even the wind sounded different there, like it carried the voices of the ones who came before. By late afternoon, the sun was slipping behind the ridges when Eli saw smoke, thin, silver threads rising from a small valley. Could have been a campfire, could have been trouble. He weighed it in his mind. The horse needed rest, and he was near the end of his supplies. He rode down slow, hand resting on the rifle tied to his saddle, eyes scanning every movement of brush and rock. When he reached the bottom, he saw it. A cabin, small but well-built, half hidden by mesquite trees. Smoke curled lazy from the chimney. Whoever lived there had made peace with the wild. He stopped a few yards from the door and called out, "Hello, the house." His voice echoed off the canyon walls, then disappeared. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. A woman stepped out. She wasn't young, but there was something unbreakable in her eyes. Her skin was copper-toned from the sun, her hair dark as coal, braided down her back. She wore a blanket around her shoulders, hand resting near a hatchet on her belt. Not threatening, just careful. She looked him over, said nothing for a while. Finally she spoke. "You're far from any town." "Got turned around in the hills," Eli said, tipping his hat, looking for a dry place for the night. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "You can tie your horse near the fence. There's water from the spring." Her voice was calm, almost emotionless, but not unkind. Eli led Juniper over, watered him, and made sure his legs were wrapped before stepping inside. The cabin smelled of smoke and sage. A fire burned in a clay hearth. A pot of something thick simmered over it. Stew, maybe. The walls were decorated with small carvings and woven mats, simple but made with care. "You live out here alone?" he asked. "I do now," she said, stirring the pot. "My husband was Apache scout for the army. He died 2 winters ago." She didn't say how. Didn't need to. The way she looked into the fire told the whole story. Eli nodded quietly. "Sorry to hear that." She glanced at him. "You eat rabbit?" "I eat whatever's warm," he said. She handed him a bowl and he took it, eating slow. It had been days since he'd had anything but jerky and hardtack. The stew was simple. Rabbit, corn, herbs, but it tasted like life. "You have a name?" she asked. "Eli Ward," he said. "You?" "Nalin," she replied. "Means flower. My mother's choosing, not mine." That night, the wind howled through the canyon, but the fire kept steady. Eli offered to sleep by the door, and she didn't argue. In the quiet, he could hear her humming softly to herself. A low tune, wordless but old, something that belonged to the earth. It reminded him of Clara, how she used to hum when she cooked, when she mended, when she thought he wasn't listening. He stared into the fire until his eyes burned, and somewhere between the crackle and the wind, he fell asleep. The next morning, he was up before dawn, splitting kindling outside. She stepped out, arms folded against the cold. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he answered. "But it feels wrong to eat someone's food and not earn it." She gave the faintest smile, the first he'd seen on her. "You talk like a man who's been alone too long." He shrugged. "Maybe." Over the next few days he stayed, helped mend her fence, fixed a roof beam that had sagged under the last rain, fetched water from the spring. She didn't ask him to stay, but she didn't tell him to leave either. There was a rhythm to the work, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire, her weaving something small with her hands, him carving bits of wood into shapes that didn't mean anything. He told her a little about Texas, about the cattle drives, about the stars you could see over the plains. She told him about the old ways, about her people's belief that every loss leaves a shadow that walks beside you until you make peace with it. On the 4th day, when Eli started saddling up to leave, she asked, "Where you go?" He cinched the strap tighter, staring at the horizon. "No place in particular." "No one waits for you?" "No one left to wait," he said quietly. She nodded, eyes soft. "You are not the only one with ghosts." Then she walked back inside. He stood there a long while, then unsaddled the horse again. Weeks passed. Winter came heavy, laying a white blanket across the valley. The cabin turned into a world of its own. Firelight, chores, silence, the slow rhythm of survival. Eli had never known peace like that. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but it was something steady, something that didn't hurt to hold. Nalin didn't talk much, but when she did, her words carried weight. One night, as they sat by the fire, she said, "You carry sorrow like a man wears armor. Keeps you safe, but also keeps you cold." Eli stared into the flames. "You lose enough. You learn not to want anything back." "You think that's strength?" she asked. "It's survival." She looked at him a long moment, then said, "Maybe the two ain't the same." He didn't have an answer. Not that night. The snow kept them trapped for nearly 2 months. They fell into a quiet companionship. Not lovers, not quite friends, just 2 broken souls who'd stopped expecting much from the world. Sometimes she'd tell stories about her people's belief that the wind was the breath of ancestors, that it carried warnings and blessings both. Eli would listen, not because he believed, but because her voice had the calm of someone who did. Other nights, he'd tell her about the trail drives, how the nights out there were so big it made a man feel smaller than dust. They never spoke about the future. Maybe they both knew better. Then one morning, the thaw came. The snow melted, The creek started to run again, and the world smelled like new earth. Eli saddled his horse. She watched from the doorway, arms crossed. "You leaving?" He nodded. "You've been kind, Nayland. I owe you more than I can pay." "You don't owe," she said softly. "You just leave because that's what you do." Her words stung more than he expected. He took a deep breath. "Maybe some of us ain't built for staying." She tilted her head slightly. "Or maybe you're just afraid to be seen." He met her eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then she said something that stopped him cold. "You want a wife, Eli Ward, or just shelter?" He froze, fingers tightening on the saddle horn. She didn't say it with anger, just quiet truth, the kind that cuts deeper than any blade. He looked at her, at the strength in her stillness, the grief she carried with grace. He wanted to answer, but the words wouldn't come. So he mounted up, tipped his hat, and rode off. The sound of his horse faded into the wind. Nalin watched until he disappeared behind the ridge, then turned back inside, shutting the door softly behind her. Eli rode for days, no direction, just miles. The question followed him like a shadow. "You want a wife or just shelter?" He thought about every woman he'd turned down, every kind gesture he'd walked away from, every time he told himself he wasn't meant for staying. Maybe Nalin was right. Maybe he'd been mistaking fear for freedom all along. The farther he rode, the heavier it got. The land stretched wide and empty, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. Not the comfortable kind of alone he'd built his life around, but the hollow kind that gnaws at a man's chest until he admits what he's been running from. One night, he camped near a dry creek bed. The fire crackled weakly, and he sat there staring into the flames. He remembered Clara, her laugh, her touch, the way she'd rest her head on his shoulder when the world went quiet. He remembered Nalin's eyes, the steady way she looked at him, not asking for anything but the truth. And in that moment, something shifted. He realized he'd spent years pretending ghosts were company. Maybe it was time to stop. The next morning, the wind carried a strange calm. The sun rose over the horizon, painting the world gold. Eli packed his things slow, then looked south, back toward the canyon. He didn't know what he'd say if he saw her again. Didn't even know if she'd want to see him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the pull of something real. Maybe it wasn't too late to turn around. He mounted his horse, took one last look at the open trail ahead, and then turned the reins toward the whispering mesa. The wind picked up, whispering through the brush, like it was telling him what he already knew. Some journeys don't end where you think they will, and some shelters aren't made of wood or stone, but of two people who finally stop running from themselves. The trail back to the canyon was harder than Eli remembered. The snowmelt had turned the riverbeds to mud, and cold rain came and went like a passing grudge. He rode in silence, following the same path he'd taken weeks ago, the same crooked trail that had led him to her door the first time. Every mile seemed to ask him the same question, that same one Nalin had spoken with quiet fire. "You want a wife, or just shelter?" It wasn't just a question anymore. It was a mirror. He thought about all the years he'd spent drifting, every empty sunrise, every lonely fire. Maybe he'd told himself he didn't need anyone because it hurt less than admitting he did. Maybe freedom wasn't what he thought it was. Maybe it was just another kind of cage. By the third day, he reached the mouth of the canyon. The air was colder there, the wind sharper. When he crested the final ridge, he saw smoke rising again from the cabin chimney. Thin and steady. He stopped for a moment, looking down. Something in his chest twisted. He didn't know if he was welcome. Didn't know what he'd find, but he rode down anyway. When his horse's hooves crunched the gravel near the fence, the door opened. Nalin stepped out, just like before, wrapped in her blanket, eyes calm and unreadable. She didn't look surprised to see him. Didn't smile, didn't frown, just stood there, waiting. He dismounted slow, took off his hat. "Didn't think you'd still be here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "This is my home," she said simply. He nodded, looking at the ground. "I rode out thinking I was done with this place. Thought I could leave it behind same as everything else." "And you couldn't," she said. He met her eyes then. "No, I couldn't." The wind sighed between them. She didn't move closer, didn't step back, just watched him like she was measuring whether he'd really come back, or if he was just passing through again. "I've been running for a long time," Eli said. "Told myself I was just meant to be alone, but I think maybe that was just me being afraid." Nalin's gaze softened. "Afraid of what?" "Of losing again," he said. "Of caring about someone, then having the world take it away." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The world takes what it wants, but it also gives. You just forget to open your hands." Eli looked at her, really looked. The lines around her eyes, the calm strength in the way she stood, the way her voice carried both pain and peace. He realized then that she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And maybe, if he was brave enough, he could learn to do the same. "I don't know what kind of man I still am," he said quietly. "But I know I don't want to keep riding away from the only thing that's felt right in years." Nalin studied him, her expression unreadable. "You think I need saving?" He shook his head. "No, I think maybe I need it." That earned the faintest hint of a smile from her. Not soft, but honest. "Then you stay," she said, "but not because you're tired, not because it's easy. You stay because you choose to." Eli nodded. "Then I choose to." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was warm. She turned back toward the cabin. "There's wood to cut," she said, almost teasing. "And the roof still leaks on the north side." He smiled faintly. "Then I guess I better earn my keep." He followed her inside. The same clay hearth glowed with new fire. The same scent of sage drifted through the air. It felt smaller now, but somehow it felt more like home than any place he'd known in years. He hung his hat by the door, set down his rifle, and for the first time in a long time, didn't feel the urge to keep it within arm's reach. Days turned to weeks. Weeks into months. The land thawed, the creek ran stronger, and the cabin filled with the sounds of work and laughter. Soft, fleeting at first, but growing steadier with time. They worked side by side, hunting, planting, mending. Some nights they spoke, some nights they didn't. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Eli sat on the porch sharpening his knife. Nalin came out with 2 tin cups of coffee and sat beside him. They watched the light fade over the mesas, the wind carrying the faint sound of coyotes far off. "You still think about her?" Nalin asked softly. He nodded. "Every day." "That's good," she said. "Means you remember where you came from. Just don't forget where you are." He turned to look at her, a quiet smile tugging at his mouth. "I won't." She reached out, laid her hand gently over his, not as a promise, not as possession, but as understanding. The kind that says 2 broken people can still build something whole. That night, Eli dreamed of Clara. But this time, she wasn't fading away. She stood beside a river, smiling, and behind her, the hills rolled wide and endless. When he woke, Nalin was still sleeping beside him, her breathing steady, the fire glowing low. He realized then that grief hadn't left him. It had simply learned to live beside something new. Spring came early that year. Wildflowers pushed through the hard soil, painting the valley in colors that hadn't been seen in seasons. Travelers passing through spoke of a quiet couple living near the canyon, a white man and an Apache widow keeping to themselves, offering water to those who asked, Some said they'd never seen a man look so at peace. Others said they'd never seen a woman look so sure. Years later, when the railroad stretched closer to the territory, someone who'd once ridden with Eli Ward passed through the valley and stopped at the cabin. He found Eli older, slower, but smiling. The visitor asked if he ever missed the trail, the open sky, the freedom. Eli looked out across the land, where the wind was stirring the grass, and Nalin was hanging herbs to dry by the porch. He took a long breath, the smell of sage and smoke thick in the air. "Freedom's a fine thing," he said, "but it ain't worth much if you got no one to share the quiet with." The visitor smiled, nodded, and rode off, leaving the couple behind in the fading light. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, Nalin sat beside Eli by the fire, weaving another basket, her hands steady and sure. Eli watched her for a long while before saying, almost to himself, "Guess I found my shelter after all." She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. "No," she said softly, smiling now, that rare, beautiful smile. "You found your home." Outside, the wind whispered through the canyon, not mournful anymore, but alive, carrying with it the story of a man who stopped running, and the woman whose strength taught him the difference between being alone and being free. And somewhere in that whisper, if you listened close enough, you could still hear her question, the one that changed everything.